the idea that Stoics are unemotional, I think they're just as emotional as anybody else, but they've realized that emotion and trying to control good actions is what you should try to do. They all exist in every person, but if you spend a lot of time trying to really focus on what makes people good in yourself, then you're going to be better off. And whether it's Stoicism or any philosophy that really focuses on ethics and morality.
Right. Ethics are not something that we just learn once and then we're good, right? It's something we need to continue to learn, to reinforce, and to iterate on within ourselves first, right? So that we can avoid that hypocrisy that you're talking about, not because it would help us build a more lucrative relationship, but to build a better relationship with our fellow man. And it's like the Greek word hamartia for sin, right? Is it means to miss the mark, right? It's an archery term. So as you're continuing to refine your grouping, so to speak, as you're firing your arrows, right? You're never going to be perfect, but it is in that striving that you continue to iterate on yourself first so that you can then take it out into the world. Is that much of it? That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Carey. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post-9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills. Episode 115 features Mick Mulroy, a Marine Corps veteran, as well as a retired Paramilitary Operations Officer at the CIA and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, where he served under General Mattis. Mick sits on the board of advisors for the Plato's Academy Center, where he works to bring philosophy, specifically Stoicism, to the forefront for modern thinkers and doers. Welcome. This is Veteran Made. This episode is brought to you by Go Pills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time.
All right. Good afternoon from the great state of Ohio for me, and good afternoon from the District of Columbia. Mick Mulroy, welcome back to Veteran Made.
Great to be back with you, Carey, especially to talk about Stoicism.
Yeah. We had a great chat last time with Worth, but I am very excited to dig in and dig a little deep here on Stoic philosophy and its application in life, more the life than in the military. I've obviously listened to you chat a few times on a handful of different Stoic podcasts, and it is interesting. I hear a lot of non-military folks ask you about the application of Stoicism in the military and how meditations is required reading, and it is and does apply very well in the military. But as you know, this show is about our life after the military, what we do after service, what we do with those skills and those experiences that we got serving wherever we served in whatever capacity we served, and taking those forward into our civilian jobs, careers, and life. So I'd like to frame the conversation about Stoic philosophy that way. For those that don't know, if you could give us just a brief primer on your introduction to Stoicism and how you got started thinking about it, and then reading about it and writing about it, and then I'll jump into some questions.
Sure. So, I think I've essentially always been a Stoic, so I was a Stoic before Stoicism was cool, as they say. I'm super happy that it's becoming really popular. But my dad taught me ethics and a lot of, morality through philosophy. He was a Jesuit priest. Obviously, he left, or I wouldn't be here, and became a scientist. So he spent a lot of time, and not just Stoicism, from Plato's Republic to mostly all based on the Greek philosophy, which is the basis of all Western philosophy. And I just really got attached to Stoicism, and I think he was too, Stoic. And so I grew up, off and on. I mean, there's, I wasn't like, 100% all the time. But it kept coming back in my life, as it does to many people. And the military, which is very prone to stoicism, I think, um, partly because it really does focus on the virtue ethics, and they're very compatible with the life of a soldier or sailor, airman, or marine. But um, and it kept coming back in that, from meditations like Yodi required reading. Um, I don't know if Enchiridion and discourses are required reading, but I think it is. Probably is. It should be. If not, probably should talk to the commandant, make sure to get that on the list if he'd listen to me. Uh, and then, I saw it throughout my time in the military and the CIA, which there's a special activities component, which is essentially the military, just under different authorities. Another conversation. But I saw it in there. I saw guys they were already interested in. They heard that I was involved in it for a long period of time, so they asked me questions. And then my last job after I retired from the agency was back at the Pentagon, and I had the privilege for working for Secretary Mattis, who was a well-known Stoic. Actually carried a copy of Meditation, so it was kind of came full circle then. And then when I got out of government entirely, um, people kind of reached out to me about writing stuff, and I really did focus on not just how the Stoicism could apply to the military, but how it could apply to the resilience needed for military service. So, although I am a big proponent of that, let's not make it all about Stoicism, all about the military, because we kind of have that audience, if you will, and but that's where I focus on. So, but I really do think, and I'm in a cabal with a lot of different people that are involved in modern Stoicism, from Donald Robertson to Ryan Holiday to Nancy Sherman to many others. We're trying to reach out, get women involved, get non-traditional Stoics. Traditionally it's been military athletes, huge with athletes, always has been, and then business people. Believe it or not, they tend to. Those are the ones I see mostly. It's scientists I see mostly, but we're trying to get non-traditional. But that's how I, you know, got involved from an early age, and I grew up in a kind of a rural area in the South, so they know what the hell I was talking about. I'm sure they do now, but
Yeah.
back then, you're either Southern Baptist or Southern Methodist, and I was like a Stoic, right?
Right.
Like I don't think that's a denomination. I'm like, it's not, but let's go. Anyway,
But
that's good. Now it's
it is
come on.
compatible with all of those denominations, right? Which I think is
Yeah,
one of the things that makes it timeless, right? And
yeah,
so you mentioned that Stoicism is getting more popular. You mentioned Ryan Holiday and some others, and
yeah.
I actually just finished Ryan's latest in the Virtue series, Right Thing, Right Now, on my flight yesterday, home from a family wedding. And he talked about in the afterword of the book about what he was like, younger in life at 18, 19 years old, as he was scaling American Apparel and discovered Stoicism. And he talked about it in the same vein that you were just describing with, high performing CEOs and high performing athletes, and high performers in the military, right? Looking at it as tools for success, right? Tools for ways to get better and at whatever it is that you do. And while it absolutely does offer that, he mentioned that what's great about Stoicism is that it works on you over time, right? And so there's this idea that there are a lot of misconceptions out there about Stoicism, right? If you ask, just anybody passing on the street, if they're reading like a fiction book and the author describes somebody as Stoic, what do you think, right? And that person will say, quiet, unemotional, strong frame, and just kind of quiet and moving their way through the world and not necessarily interacting with it or their emotions so much. When in reality, Stoicism is a tool, and was developed as a tool, as a set of philosophical tools to get better, but it was to get better at everything, including your inner life, including how you interact with your own emotions, not to just dismiss your emotions, but to understand your emotions, how they make you feel, what they make you think, observe those thoughts, observe those feelings, break them down, and figure out kind of how to move forward. So what are some of those misconceptions about Stoicism that you've encountered in this work that you've been doing post-government service? And you mentioned a couple of them already, that you're working with folks on trying to bring more people into the fold. But what are some of those misconceptions that you noticed, and how are you using your platform within the community to help shine a light on them?
Yeah, so the first one Carey already brought up is the idea of the Stoics unemotional, right? That and because we use that term in that manner, when the Stoics have always, understood that, man, collectively, right, man and woman, is an emotional being. I mean, you don't have to be an anthropologist or a psychologist to realize that. So the Stoics wanted to control it in a way that was most beneficial to the person and society, right? And I think that's one of the issues that I see, that people that are challenged by Stoicism are challenged by that concept, um, because it really is about controlling your anger. And anger is a really big problem in society today. I mean, it's the root of violence, to be extreme. It's also the root of rudeness, and it's the root of families falling apart, and it's a lot of the bad things that happen in a person's life, both to themselves and to their relationships. So it's not about not having them, but it's about controlling them to the point that you don't lead with your temper, and I think that's what a lot of the men, specifically, that I know, um, struggle with. But it's also the reason to be a Stoic, right? Because I also view hypocrisy as one of the worst, sins, if you will. Like, I would rather, if a person is a world class a hole, and they said they were. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but at least they're not BSing, you know?
Right.
Like, I'm an a hole, and I know I'm an a hole, and, but the person who runs around holier than thou and, lecturing other people on what they should be, and is an a hole, that's the worst. So it's like a religion too. Like, if you really are committed to trying to be, a Stoic, and some people don't like to say they're Stoics. It has to do with, it's almost arrogant because, but that really, I don't want to get sidetracked. But a sage is somebody who's kind of mastered Stoicism, and for real Stoics, like, nobody can ever be a sage. It's always trying to attain it, right? So if you said I'm a sage, you'd be like, oh, geez, this guy really
Yeah.
doesn't understand Stoicism. It's like always trying to attain that stage of eudaimonia. It's kind of like nirvana for Stoics. But you can never really attain it. And if you could, it wouldn't be up to you to claim you did. It'd be somebody else, saying Epictetus was, a sage or something, but he would never say it. But the point being is, if you're trying to attain that, even if you're going in the right direction. Like, any progress is progress. So many different Stoics have a quote that says that. Like, if you're a 4 on the good scale trying to get to a 5, at least you're getting to a 5. You know what I mean?
Right.
And if you're
Yeah.
not being dishonest with yourself, then you're going to start moving in the right direction. So I think, the idea that Stoics are unemotional, I think they're just as emotional as anybody else, but they've realized that emotion and trying to control good actions, compassion and generosity and honesty, is what you should try to do. Get away from greed and jealousy and, and it's they all exist in every person. But if you spend a lot of time trying to really focus on what makes people good in yourself, then you're going to be better off. And whether it's Stoicism or any philosophy that really focuses on ethics.
Right. Like, the ethics are not something that we just learn once and then we're good. Right. It's something we need to
Right.
continue to learn, to reinforce, and to iterate on within ourselves first. Right. So that we can avoid that hypocrisy that you're talking about, not because it would help us build, a more lucrative relationship, but to build a better relationship with our fellow man. And it's like that, the Greek word hamartia for sin, right, is it means to miss the mark, right? It's an archery term. So as you're continuing to refine your grouping, so to speak, as you're firing your arrows, right, you're never going to be perfect, but it is in that striving that you continue to iterate on yourself first, so that you can then take it out into the world. I mean, on that note, I mean, one thing that I think another misconception about Stoicism is that it is all about the individual, right? It's all about our individual responsibility, and that we can kind of ignore the world, when in reality it's the inverse, right? So that we can have our own individual responsibility, so that we can better interact with the world. And obviously, right now, and across time, there's each time and each culture kind of has their thing that they deal with, right? Generationally, weirdly, it doesn't actually change all that much as you look over the last few thousand years of human civilization. We like to think, because we live in this present moment, that the things we're dealing with are the most difficult and the most prescient and all those things. But in your view, like, how does individual responsibility scale to the collective, right? And like, how do you think about the idea of being personally responsible while also being as responsible as you can be for the collective? And where, if you draw a line, like, where do you draw the line between, the individual and the collective?
So if you ever get a chance to read, Epictetus's Handbook or Enchiridion, he starts with saying, the first step is to get your stuff in one sock, and I know you know that expression, but basically take care of yourself. And it's not about being self-absorbed, right? It's about, like, you really can't be that helpful to the world if you're all over the place in your own self. So, the way I read it, and I think the way most people read it, is once you get yourself where you're centered, your ego doesn't control you. You realize, you're just one person in this world, and what makes a successful life is not what you own, or what position of power you have or something like that. It is, basically being a good person and doing good deeds. you know and ultimately, if that's what you do in life, then you have had a successful life, probably more so than a billionaire who was you know out for himself the whole time and didn't help anybody. And then it talks about, as Stoicism at its start did, from Zeno forward, you know, um, the basic tenets of, yes, virtue ethics, which is how you act toward other people, right? Courage isn't a singleton thing. Justice is about looking out for other people. Anybody looked out for justice for themselves, right? Um, wisdom. Wisdom isn't just, knowing a bunch of facts. It's actually challenging your own assumptions, learning more, listening, not talking so much. And then, of course, self-discipline, which really gets to the anger management. But there's also this idea of logic. When Stoicism started, it was just as much about logic and physics, science, the natural world. No one taking the time to learn about your natural world and your part in it. So another concept in Stoicism is to live in harmony with nature, if you will. That's all about external, right? That's about your place in a much bigger world. And that they took that concept into, how they originally viewed God, for example, and that we were just one part of a much bigger, broader deity, if you will. But that is how I view Stoicism. Is you get yourself into a place where you can be of value to your family, your friends, your society, and then the whole universal concept of citizenship is Stoic, right? So it is actually all about improving the lot of humans, and living in harmony with nature, which could be. Can you give me just 1 second, Carey?
Yes.
Just 1 second.
Yep.
All right, I'm back. I love Stoicism, but I love my wife too, and she just took off to the airport, so I had to
Yeah.
say bye.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. See, looking beyond myself, believe
There
me,
you
it was in
go.
my own
Yeah.
interest to take that.
Integrating yourself with the collective you're most close to. Yeah.
Yeah, right. She hears
Yeah.
about Stoicism all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it is way bigger. It's not a self-absorbed. I guess the way I would look at it, it's opposite. It's trying to make yourself a better person for everybody else. I mean, and it's not about living on a mountaintop and just being by yourself and all that. It is about, you know, how you act toward others, how that fits into a family, a society, a nation, and then, um, cosmopolitanism that Stoicism is preached since Zeno. In fact, I just did a comparison of Plato's Republic and Zeno's Republic. Not a lot of people are familiar with Zeno's Republic, but I just wrote a paper on that. But he really talks about that as a concept of this egalitarian nature of what he thinks the ideal form of man would be.
Yeah, I think that tends to get lost with a lot of philosophies and religions in particular, right? Like as if you look at religious belief, a lot of time there's this misconception that you get saved or salvation or kind of whatever that is, right, for each religion, in order to just be safe and saved and avoid the bad place and go to the good place.
Right.
When in reality, if you look at all of these practitioners when they were on the earth speaking about these things and teaching these things, it was, well, no, you have access to these tenets and to these beliefs so that you may use them in the world to make your immediate, whatever you can control, right? My dad used to call it, when he taught corporations and businesses and sports teams, like your 20 square feet, right? What is the 20 square feet that you are responsible for, that you can control, that you can influence, that will then be that will then not collide with, but then will be built on top of and next to each other person's 20 square feet, so that you're responsible for what you're responsible for. So you need to take care of yourself first so that you can then contribute your portion. And if everybody does that together, well, then the entire collective moves forward. Right.
Same concept. And obviously not unique to Stoicism, but that is a very one of the premises, I think, of Stoicism.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's how I was taught Stoicism. My dad was a leadership and culture coach, for lack of a better word, consultant. Right? They used to call, I guess they probably still call it that. But back in the day, he was a management consultant. But he developed a curriculum. It was very Stoic. He used the equation E plus R equals O, event plus response equals outcome. You are not responsible for the events that happen to you and happen around you, but you are responsible for how you respond to those in order to achieve the best outcome, right? And the big misconception there was that you could get whatever outcome you want. Well, no, your response is in response to an event that did in fact happen or is happening. And both of those are going to influence whatever the outcome is. But there's only one of those things that you control, which is how you respond, right? And that is the core tenet of Stoicism.
Yes, it is. Totally. I mean, everybody gets knocked down, right? It's all about whether you get back up and how you get back.
Right. That's right. It's interesting because, as Stoicism becomes more popular, as you know, I just traveled to Athens with my wife because we were emailing a little bit about it. Went to a bar that you recommended. Thank you again. We had a great time sitting right outside the Stoa.
Right. Yeah.
There. And but we did a walking tour, the Democracy and Philosophy walking tour around Athens with a small group. Our guide was incredible. It was retired like marketing and advertising guy for like cruise ships or something like that. But in his retirement, he runs this walking tour and just did a great job and took us around all the schools. He asked people at the beginning what you're most interested in learning about or hearing more about. And, each person that was there for a different reason, right? There was a couple of, German students that were interested in political philosophy, right? And then they were asking lots of questions that were, very downstream of kind of their understanding of modern democracy, right? And obviously I was pretty interested in Stoicism, and there was somebody who was interested in Epicureanism there. And as we walked and talked, he kept talking about Plato and Socrates, right? And how really kind of all of Western thought, modern Western thought and action is downstream of ancient philosophy. And we tend to think these days that modern is good, ancient is old, outdated. And because these people made mistakes that we now view as mortal sins, right? Slavery, sexism, all of those things that we tend to talk about in modernity for good reason. We then dispense with a lot of the ancient philosophy, and we have a hard time connecting what was timeless about it, regardless of the mistakes that the practitioners or teachers made, and how we can take it and not just move forward with it, but how it is moving forward even without us, right? Like our modern democracies are downstream of these ancient philosophies. So it's not that modernity is inherently bad, but I do think we do tend to lose sight of what is timeless about a lot of these ancient teachings, and not just because they came before us, but because we are in fact we're living downstream of them.
Yes, in fact, when I was doing the research for the paper I referenced, I mean, I obviously knew about Zeno's basic response to Plato's Republic. And, Plato, as I'm sure you're familiar, talked about several different forms of government. His ideal, the philosopher king one, still was like a benevolent dictator, right? It was just like a philosopher that was in charge of everybody. I know that's simplifying it, but Zeno would be progressive today.
Right.
If you read, and there's not enough remaining, but there's a lot of people that did read the original script and familiar that wrote about it. So there's enough out there to know, wow. I mean, Zeno at a time he lived and he was in Plato's academy, or at least studied there, and studied from other of Socrates' student pupils, direct pupils, and of course, Socrates is considered the godfather, if you will, of Stoicism. But he was way progressive. We're talking, universal rights, which included voting for people that didn't just own stuff. Females were the same. Slaves and non-slaves were essentially, and that's a big part of Stoicism. Is you could have Marcus Aurelius as one major pillar, and Epictetus, the slave, which literally means slave, as another pillar. It was very what we would say modern nowadays, but it was looking into an ideal future ahead that we still haven't attained. And in fact, I mean, if you look at where the world's going right now, we're going further away from democracy in many cases. Democracies are becoming less democratic, and countries are becoming not democracies. Autocracies seems to be a trend. And even people that live in democracies, for some reason, have now become enamored with autocracies. So there's never been a better time to start looking back at the ancient doctrines that really do stand the test of time. I would say Stoicism would be one, to guidance about where we should be. And if you don't think that's where we should be, let's debate it. Can use it as a reason to in a format to debate where we should be. And gender equality, of course, is something that's huge in the world today, and backsliding in many places. So that's another thing that I think Stoicism should take on is gender equality, and the slide toward autocracy, because there's really the foundational document of the philosophy addresses it straight on, and in a way that I think most people would find more in line with where modern democracies want to go.
Right. Yeah. I mean, these days, right, when we think about philosophy, well, maybe not you and I, but when some people think about philosophy, they think about the academy and that it stays there, right? And like you go and study philosophy, or you take some philosophy classes so that you can get a base level understanding, and then you go study the thing that you really want to do, and then you go get that job, and then you go do that thing, and then you kind of forget all that philosophy, right? Whereas back in Athens, just to use Athens as an example, back in Athens, Plato had the academy did exist. But then all of the schools, not just the Stoics, although I do think the Stoics were probably the best example of this, although I think we're biased, but they took it back to the marketplace. And that's where they discussed all of the ideas, right? This marketplace of ideas that we talk about today on X or Instagram or, the news or whatever it is, like that's not the marketplace they were talking about. They were talking about the actual marketplace where merchants were trading, where merchants were selling, where, slaves and free men alike went, where soldiers went, where, the politicians of the day went. They were all there together in the marketplace. And all of these, all of the Stoics that we revere today, that we read, they all did different things, but they did things, to your point about Marcus and to your point about Epictetus, right? So this idea that philosophy is this pie in the sky foo-foo thing, it's the application of knowledge in the day-to-day, whatever it is that you're doing, with an eye, an ear, a heart, and a mind towards being a better citizen.
Yeah, and the Academy, I'm not part of Plato's Academy Center, which is an NGO they know where the Academy is. It's Dog Park right now, and so they're actually excavating it. They think they've already located Plato's tomb because they know it should be there. They did ground penetrating radar. They think they've found it. So super exciting. But to your point, the Stoics, I mean, it's named after a porch, right? The painted porch, because they used to meet there. And I also had a Greek philosophy professor told me that he did most of his teaching, or a lot of it, walking. Students
Hmm.
would walk with him, and they'd walk in the mountains around, what I'm talking about because you're just there, the mountains around there talking. And according to the professor, it was a very unique way of learning when you're walking in somebody and he's teaching, because it's not dictatorial. It's more of a discussion. And if you've noticed, sometimes it's easier to talk to somebody when you're walking, or in modern terms, driving, where you're not staring. You
Yes.
know what I mean? Because it gives you your
Yep.
ability to. He had this theory on the whole thing that is really one of the core original beauties of Stoicism, which was it was a common man's thing, but you could be, you know, lofty or the average dude or lady, um, and but it was also very much not structured. It's like meet on the
Right.
porch, talk on the porch, walk around the town, walk into the mountains, and talk about the meaning of life and where you fit in it.
Yeah, it's back to that harmony with nature that you're describing. It's physical then too, right? You're moving your body, your blood is pumping,
Yeah,
you're breathing a little bit harder, you're speaking while you're walking, right? Like I love going on. I'm a big hiker, right? And so I would go on hikes with family or friends, and we just have great conversations. And it tires you out even more, both physically and mentally, right? Because you're talking and you're breathing, as
Mhm.
you're ascending. And so that kind of harmony with nature, I think, is there too. But I stand now during these podcasts. I used to
Yeah.
sit, and then I noticed that I performed better, for my guest when I was
Mhm.
standing, because I was more engaged physically from toe to crown, right? Like I'm
Mhm.
here, and yes, we're looking at each other through the screen, but I add that little physicality, as a means to stay present and grounded, in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the athletic part of Stoicism has always been there too. Um, if you look at Cleothenes, the next one after Zeno, he was a boxer. Chrysippus, which probably did more, he did more to really advance Stoicism as an actual structural philosophy. He was famous as a runner, right? And he didn't become Stoic because he was a runner, but it's always been there. And when I've done several Stoic conferences, and we always have Olympic athletes there that are Stoics. We've always had champion tennis players and speed skaters, boxers. Uh, yeah, we've in fact Boris Becker. I think Boris Becker. The one got in a little trouble. He was a Wimbledon champion. He got in little issues with taxes or something, but he became a
Okay.
big Stoic, and now he comes to a lot of these conferences. And I think generally found that life isn't just about being successful; it's about being successful as a person. But
Right.
every time I go to these conferences, there's world class Olympic athletes that really have looked at Stoicism as something not only to follow in life, but to actually help them in their sport.
Right. It's that idea of activity, right? I think is core to it, because using athletics as an example, you're not just waiting, right? As Marcus said, it's not about what happens to you, it's about how you respond to what happens to you. Well, you don't want to be passive and just sitting around waiting for things to happen for you to respond to, right? Like you can move through the world, um, with certain outcomes in mind, and focused on outcomes that you're looking for, whether they be personal or relational or emotional or professional. And so then that also then keeps you, on guard, so to speak, and you're actively looking for these different events, and then you're actively working on a response as you move. It's not this passive nature of just sitting and waiting and having the perfect response. That response, A, like we've already talked about, is never going to be perfect. And B, you've got to be moving. You've got to be ready. You can't just be sitting around and waiting.
That's right. You got to make your own luck, right?
Yeah.
That's a part of a lot of philosophies. Is preparation is the best form of luck, and I think philosophy of Stoicism is the same way. And it goes to preparing yourself first, so that you can be a benefit to others, including on your team, like you said, your dad's philosophy. That's very much the case in life. But also with Stoicism, I think it's really one of those that never, like you said, you don't just learn it and then you're good. Check the box and move on. In order for it to really be effective, it has to be a lifetime, to me, a commitment. And you have to be perfect. You have to accept, you're going to make mistakes, and then you need to get back on the horse. And you got to keep reading. You got to keep reading and keep learning, and that's why so many people read Meditations, because it's so honest. Because he wasn't writing it as a book; he was writing it for himself. It wasn't intended to be published, and he really is pretty hard on himself, and he sets a really high standard. Of because it's hard to, like, he's telling himself he needs to be much nicer to people that are essentially ignorant and selfish. Because I mean, there's a lot about it that really isn't easy. It does set a very high bar. Whether it's Epictetus talking about the sage, the actual sage that he calls the cynic, because that's kind of where Stoicism came from, cynicism. But it's really tough. It's like even if you're beat, even if you're whipped, you love the person that whipped you. Not a lot of guys I know that can do that. So it really does set a high, or ladies, really does set a high bar, and one that is not easy to meet. If it was easy to meet, probably wouldn't be as popular as it is today. But it really is kind of the ideal person is what they have in mind, the sage Stoicism.
Yeah, that's it. My wife and I remind each other of it intentionally and constantly, right? Like as we have a 4.5-year-old. So as we continue to be married and work on our marriage, over time, because again, you don't just get married and then you're good. You get married and you continue to strengthen yourself and the partnership as you move forward. And then you have children. So we constantly remind ourselves and each other that I have extremely high standards for myself. She has extremely high standards for herself. Then we both have extremely high standards for each other, and then for our children and our family. So that often, right, can result in uncomfortable conversations. And then we remind each other, hey, we're having this uncomfortable conversation. And we say this out loud. We say it. We're having this uncomfortable conversation because we have high standards. If we didn't have high standards, we would not be having this conversation, and therefore the problem would not have the opportunity to be solved, however big or however small that problem is. And that scales up and down, right, as you know. You mentioned reading, and it was a good segue into a question that I had. What is your framework for reading in general, but obviously specific to Stoic philosophy here? What is your cadence and your framework for reading and for taking notes on these documents and books that you've been reading now for probably the majority of your life? Because I'm a reader and a rereader. I use a different color highlighter each time that I read, and then I'll bring a pen into it and different color pens and things like that, so I can clock my own journey over time, but then also make sure that I don't forget those first things that I highlighted. But now I'm highlighting something new because I'm a different person. It's a different river. But how do you approach it?
Yeah. So first of all, I have a couple rules for myself. I read a lot, especially on national security, because it's my day job, if you will, and I'm an analyst for television, the news, ABC. So I'm constantly reading, but I refuse to allow myself that to count as reading. It is, but it's right. Like I'm reading articles real quick to talk about, what Israel is going to do in retaliation to, fill in blank. That can't count, or that's all the reading I do, because I do it all day. Reading to me really has to be a book, because somebody took the time to write something substantial, or long articles, I should say, in that realm about something, not just about facts that happened, which is the news. It has to be about something and their analysis of it. And like, there's got to be a point of it, not just to repeat that, a hurricane went through Florida and all these bad things happened. And I read that for the news, for example, but I want to read something that somebody's put a lot of thought to and there's a point behind it. And that's what counts as reading to me. I try to do something different, but I also try to go back to the core documents, if you will, when it comes to Stoicism, but with a twist. I've read them all in the kind of original, if you will. I find myself sometimes going through about 6 pages, and I'm like, oh, I need to stop and go. But I'm not even comprehending what I'm not picking up what these guys putting down, right? Because it's in another lingo. So I really do think that the modern versions done well can really help you understand it, because then you're not also trying to reinterpret old English or what have you. In it's actually somebody's done the legwork to explain it to you in modern terms so you can get more to the purpose. So I know some people are, purist and don't like that, but I'm the opposite. I think I've read it as best I can in the old versions, but I really like the guys that put it into terms that are modern. So whenever a new version of discourses, or Seneca's works, or any of them, I like. And also, I do like the modern Stoic because you have to make it relevant to today. I do love the whole idea of having our, pillars of Stoicism and knowing who they are and knowing our history, but it has to adapt to modern day, and that means it's a living, breathing philosophy. So the people that are working today in the areas, I spent a lot of time reading their stuff because it has to advance, it has to connect with people to continue to expand and exist. And I think that some people are doing that in today's society. And I mean, look at like Ryan Holiday already mentioned, I did his podcast. I go all over the world for my job. I'm in a lot of conferences, mostly for national security. Probably 50% of the time, somebody comes up to me in one of these conferences and he goes, you also talk about Stoicism, don't you? And then the rest of the time we just talk about Stoicism. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
is, people from all over the world. It's young people. And I think a lot of them, I'm not plugging Ryan, but I'm plugging Ryan. A lot of them are interested, especially young men are interested because of him. They just are. They listen to his podcast, fairly religiously, and it's really given them some other aspect of their life that they've told me many times they wouldn't have. Like they wouldn't have. They would be focused on, I don't know, gaming or, women, of course, which I mean, you could do both. But
Yeah.
they just wouldn't have like this centered existence, is what somebody has told me. A mid 30s, a guy who's very successful, but isn't married and hasn't had a kid yet. And he said, like, if it wasn't for Stoicism, I'd just be, I don't know, kind of lost. I'm doing so good that he's done really good in business. I'm just using this guy as an example to the point where he doesn't have to do really good in business anymore. Right. So he's kind of like, what's left? And then he
Right.
found Stoicism through Ryan,
Yeah.
through his podcast. But so I know you asked about reading. So mine is, it has to be something that it was written for a purpose to try to teach you something or get you to think about something. And the other part is, do read the modern interpretations and support the modern people in the area, because I think that's what's going to be needed to get more people interested and to keep the philosophy going. If you're Stoic.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I also think Ryan's a great example of that, right? Like in his, specifically in the Virtue series, but in the first trilogy that he did, he talks about people who exemplified Stoic traits without, he talks about Mattis, he talks about Washington, he talks about Stockdale, he talks about these guys that were in fact, readers and studiers of Stoicism. But then the vast majority of the examples that he uses in those books are people that were exemplifying Stoic virtues, not realizing that they were exemplifying Stoic virtue, right? And so I think that shows what you're talking about, which is which is showing people that there is a foundation here that you can, if you like that and you want to be more like that, well, you can go find more things in Stoic philosophy, but that it scales and it works on people even if they're not necessarily working on it specifically themselves.
True. I wrote a paper about a friend of mine who he was a child soldier. And, it's a long story for another episode, if you will, but he exemplified Stoicism, even though he, was raised in a mud hut in a very, very, very rural, isolated place in Uganda. But I wrote a paper called "A Stoic and Didn't Know It" about Anthony Opoka, one of my closest friends now. But I found every trait that I ever wanted to exemplify of Stoicism in him, and he probably still would call himself a Stoic, but it's hard to be friends with me for a long period of time without hearing a lot about Stoicism, even if you don't want
Right.
to.
Right.
So he knows
Yeah.
it now, but and I wrote a paper about it. But it's to your point. There are plenty of people that exemplified Stoicism that may not call themselves Stoics, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't, hold them up as example that you would want to be like, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like it's this, obviously there's a military application to what I'm about to say as well, but I think about it more on the private sector side, the corporate side, because I work in advertising now and storytelling, right? Brand storytelling and product storytelling. And people get very, very married to strategy and forget that tactics are what's downstream of strategy. And yes, you absolutely have to have a strategy, but as you know better than most, like you can have a strategy and then you get on the ground. Well, and that strategy is not going to work. So what tactics are you reverting to, right? Like you're never going to rise to the occasion. You're actually just going to revert to the level of your training, which I know is a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. And so what I love about Stoic philosophy is it really bridges that gap between strategy and tactics. By all means, have a strategy, but you got to have some tactics that that you can engage in day to day, minute to minute. They're going to get you to that next opportunity to be a better citizen.
And you got to be willing to assess your strategy and figure out if it's working, right? Or are you meeting your objectives to get to where you want to go? And if you're
Right.
not honest about that, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, you're never going to get there. So yeah, and I think part of wisdom is being honest about what you know, what you don't know, and whether what you're doing is meeting your objectives, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. Want to be respectful of your time. So I'll ask you the same question, Mick, that I asked you last time, obviously in a slightly different context here. But what's on your heart and your mind for our community? In this case, the military and veteran community, or in this case, if you want to apply it to the growing Stoic community, go for it. What's on your heart and your mind for us right now? Whether it's something you want to reiterate that we've talked about today, provide a piece of advice, or just get something off your chest. But Mick, what's on your heart? What's on your mind?
So one thing that I've spent a lot of time on recently, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future, is we started a group. It's called Lobo Institute. It takes people who want to get involved in humanitarian efforts worldwide, and it's primarily former military people, but it also is a mixture with humanitarians. So Marine Corps and Peace Corps, kind of. It's a combination of both. And we have started working in Gaza. We started working in Sudan. We're moving on to other places. So it doesn't matter if it's with us or what I'm calling for people is if you have these skills that you might have acquired over many years as a member of the military, you might want to look at that as an option for what you do after, you've hung up your boots, so to speak. You can wear boots in these really hard hit areas and do a lot of good. And although we're not necessarily always welcomed open arms with some of these groups in there who, for whatever reason, have some issues with military folk, I promise you that when you do good stuff, eventually you'll be accepted. And either way, you're going to be helping people that need to be helped, and your skills are very much needed in these disaster areas, in these conflict areas where people are so much in need. So that would be kind of my call to arms for folks today. It is very much needed. Obviously, if you're interested in us, you can look on our website. It's levelinstitute.org. Or there's plenty of veterans group out there. It's become, I think, much more of a thing. So it's not just us. There's other groups that are out there doing a lot of work in crisis areas around the world based on their former skills as a military member.
Plenty still to do and plenty of places to do it. Well, Mick, I appreciate your time. Appreciate your words. Appreciate this chat. I'm sure we'll do it again.
Absolutely.
But, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks, Carey. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
You too.